So the deepening of the understanding is something that starts to bring about a change in the way that we actually feel and experience ourself and life. What that really means in practical terms is the deepening of the understanding means less suffering, because movements that happen within us are seen to be happenings and not my doing. And as certain movements are seen to be a happening and not my doing, there is less involvement in that movement. And what does involvement mean? Involvement means less being lost in the movement as what you are. So I'll repeat, the deepening of the understanding is necessary in order for the experience of life to start to change, such that we start to know ourselves and experience life differently. And in practical terms, knowing ourselves and experiencing life differently means the lessening of suffering, and that suffering lessens when movements that previously were believed and felt and taken to be my doing, who I am, are witnessed, are seen to be automatic happenings. And the very fact that something is seen to be a happening means that there has been a disidentification from it. And disidentification means a movement from being lost in that activity as who I am, to knowing that that activity, for example, thinking or suffering or the functioning of the body, to seeing that as a happening. What does a happening mean? A happening means it's something that appears, something that happens and you didn't make it happen. It is not who you are. Now, I'm focusing on this because often the question, the yearning in a seeker is, so how do I make the understanding go deeper? And that question is asked because the teaching has been heard over and over again, the concepts have been heard over and over again, and the recognition is, yes, I understand the concepts. I've heard them over and over again. I can repeat them to you. I can present the framework because I've understood it and heard it. And yet, there is a sense that something's not quite right, or not really a sense, but we notice that the suffering isn't being interfered with. And when the suffering happens, there is a complete involvement in it. And that complete involvement makes it feel like it's very intense. And so what is known, what is felt is, well, actually this intellectual understanding isn't actually making much difference. And either the seeker says, well, this isn't what seeking is about, or there is a sense, well, I think this is what it's about, but obviously it hasn't penetrated down to the depths that it needs to penetrate to. And so then the question is, okay, so how am I supposed to get the understanding to go deeper? Now, on the one hand, it's an invalid question. And we'll talk about why it's an invalid question. And on the other hand, it's a question that it has two answers. One of my answers is to say it's an invalid question and explain why it's an invalid question. The other is to actually give an answer that is not validating the question, but saying, yeah, this information, which is an answer to your question, can be part of the deepening. So first, why is it an invalid question? The reason it's an invalid question is it's asked from the belief in doership. It's asked from a way of seeing life that says, well, if something's going to happen within me, if an understanding is going to deepen, I have to make it happen. I have to do something. I have to affect it. And it's very significant to see that, oh, yes, that's the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. And it's forcing the question to be asked, meaning it's saying, well, I'd like this to happen, so tell me what to do. And this isn't a criticism. This is actually, if we're honest with ourselves, seeking, the more honest we become, the less defensive we are about how we are designed. It means the more clearly we are seeing things. And so on the one hand, it can seem like if I acknowledge something like the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, that's acknowledging my failing or my shortcoming, and the doership and attachment to outcome dynamic doesn't want to acknowledge its shortcomings. It wants to present itself as perfect and not misunderstanding, but understanding. And even that is understandable when we know that that identity wants to be loved, wants to be perfect. It thinks that if it's going to get love, the best way to get love is when it is perfect. And it wants to feel good enough. And so the best way to feel good enough is when it thinks it understands everything. So that's the reason behind that happening. And so it's not a criticism. It's just the unfolding of that deeply ingrained belief. When we reconfigure our motive and say, actually, I just want to understand this. Let me put my defenses down and see what's what. So when this question comes up, it is a perfect indication to us of the ingrained belief about how life works, the ingrained belief about who I am. And essentially who I am means I am the doer. We see ourselves as the one that will make something happen. So that is a significant aspect of what we know of ourselves. I am the one that will make change happen. I am the one that will make life happen. That's part of how we know ourselves. So to see that is something that can be very insightful. It can be a seeing for ourselves based on something that is actually arising, not based on some concept that says deeply ingrained. All human beings start off from a young age with this belief in personal doership forming. That's a concept. And so you can say, oh, well, I have the belief of personal doership because the concept says all human beings get developed by life with this deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. Now, the thing is, we need to see that in ourselves, not just believe the concept. The concept is accurate, but believing a concept or understanding a concept in principle or understanding it intellectually is one thing, but it doesn't actually go very far. It's the starting point. So we need to understand it intellectually. If we don't understand it intellectually, it can't deepen. But if it's only understood intellectually or conceptually, then it doesn't deepen. The deepening is the process of the understanding, observing what the understanding is talking about for oneself in one's own daily life experience. And as we see it, oh, there it is. That's the intellectual understanding going deeper. So the concept is everyone is formed by life with a deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome. Now, you can't really see doership and attachment to outcome unless you know what that looks like in practice, or what doership and attachment to outcome means in terms of a belief and what it will drive us to do, how it will drive us to act. So what I'm describing here is one of the expressions of the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. The expression that is an attitude towards life that we can see presenting itself over and over in the way that we engage in life. In particular, the way that our thoughts think about life, especially think about the past and the future. And so this question, how do I get the understanding to go deeper, is one of those thoughts that is manifesting itself in the form of a question that demonstrates the belief in personal doership. So if we see it, if it gets pointed out, it's like, oh, of course. Because what would the belief in, what would the absence of the belief in personal doership think about life? What does the absence of the absence of the belief in personal doership, how does a human being that doesn't have the belief of personal doership, how does it see life? The answer is it sees life as a happening and understands that whatever is going to happen at exactly the time it happens. Meaning that there is no doer that will make life happen. Now, that doesn't mean that understanding leads to passivity and non-participation in life. What I'm talking about is an attitude. An attitude meaning first it requires to understand the dynamic of non-doership. Like, what does it really mean? How, on what basis am I said to be the non-doer? So the concept in the teachings is, you are not the doer. You have never been a doer. You will never be a doer. No one in all of time has ever done anything. And so there is the experience of the body having opened the fridge, the body having turned on the shower, the body having washed itself in the shower and brushed its teeth and written letters and typed emails, spoken to parents and friends and work colleagues and done your job. So you say, well, I have an experience of having done things in life. And yet the concept repeats, no one has ever done anything. Now, that doesn't mean life is all illusory appearance and really nothing has happened. We can make that argument. That's a different teaching perspective. And so we won't go there for now. So it doesn't mean that life is just an illusion and nothing has ever happened. This is not saying nothing has ever happened. This is acknowledging, yes, you have written emails, you have spoken to friends, you have done the dishes, you have turned on the shower. All of those things have happened in life, no denying that. But nobody has ever done any of that. So we scratch our head and go, what does it mean? Nobody has ever done any of that. Really, we have to think about it and say, it doesn't sound coherent. You've never done anything, and yet we know we've functioned. And so hopefully our thinking, the working mind, the intellect, can figure out the context in which the words are being used. No one has ever done anything. It doesn't done, in this context, doesn't mean functioning. Because clearly we have been functioning, we're talking, we're doing the dishes, we're driving a car. So functioning happens. That's the point. Functioning happens, and there is no individual doer thereof. So Buddha has a very nice little saying: events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. Events happen, thunderstorm, for example, floods, sunshine. That's an event. Events happen, deeds are done. That means washing the dishes gets done, driving cars get done. Consequences happen. You're washing the dishes, the plate is slippery, falls on the floor, breaks, and then someone cuts their foot. So events happen, deeds are done, washing the dishes, dish breaks, there's a consequence, cut foot. But there is no individual doer thereof, meaning there isn't a doer doing the event, there isn't a doer doing the washing of the dishes, and there isn't a doer that cut their foot. It's saying everything is happening automatically, and the body-mind organism is moving on its own without the need of a controller, without the need of a pilot. It says there is no pilot in the body-mind organism. The body-mind organism is a very complex instrument that will move in circumstance, will react, will respond in circumstance exactly according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when the dishes are dirty, the body-mind organism includes the conditioning that says, you can't leave the dishes undone for too long because mice will come and the house, it's unhygienic and all of that. That's the part of the conditioning of the body-mind organism. And so the washing of the dishes happens according to the body-mind organism, its design. And if a particular person is not conditioned a certain way, then the dishes don't happen. The washing of the dishes doesn't happen. Now we are convinced that what I am is the body, mind organism, and I, which is really a me thought. There's a me thought that says, and this me, which is a psychological entity, controls the body and controls whatever happens in the body, controls the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts. This is often referred to as identification with the body-mind organism. And it's this me thought that says, I am the one making the body function a certain way, especially the misunderstanding of the thinking. So thoughts just arise as part of this body-mind organism that is programmed by life. Thoughts just arise. They have whatever content to them and they create whatever feeling and whatever emotion. And the me thought says, that's my doing. I created that. The me thought is actually an output of that very same body-mind organism. If the me thought wasn't there, there would be no claiming ownership. And the me thought is an output of the body-mind organism. So how can this me thought, that is a belief, which is, we can say, deeply ingrained belief that creates these thoughts, this attitude to whatever happens. Oh, that's my thought, that's my feeling, that was my action, I should have done it better. That's your thought, your action, you should have done it better. Commenting on how everyone is functioning, saying, you're not doing the right thing, you should be this way. It's the me thought, and it is an output of the body-mind organism that doesn't have a pilot. The pilot comes into existence in this me thought. Now, because it's a me thought, it's not actually a pilot that does any controlling. It's just a belief that thinks it does the controlling. How strange is life? So these descriptions are here so that the understanding of non-doership can deepen. So the simple, I could say it in the first 2 minutes and say, suffering is caused because we believe we're the doer. Actually, we're not the doer because the body-mind organism is functioning according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. Life, not the body-mind organism, is what put the genes and up-to-date conditioning in place. And genes and up-to-date conditioning means the entire body, whether it's got big muscles or small muscles, whether it's 6 foot or 5 foot or 7 foot, whether it has green eyes, blue eyes, whether the heart is healthy or not healthy, the blood type, the intellect capacity, the emotional capacity, all of that is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the concept could be very simple. It is very simple, and I could just leave it at that. That suffering arises because we believe we're the doer. Actually, there is no doer. There's just a body-mind organism that is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning that life put in place. That's it. And I have a dear friend that scratches his head. The understanding is deep, total for him. And he scratches his head because I just don't get it. Why do so many people keep asking, isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious that we're not the doers? And the thing is, it is obvious once the deepening has happened. I suspect that because of the way his destiny was, that there wasn't much deepening required. He had been brought up in a family that included this sort of attitude. So from a young age, I think, and his way of seeing life was sort of like this from a young age. So when he heard Ramesh describe this, he said, it's just obvious. And then, but he finds it hard to understand, why is it that people don't get this? Isn't it obvious? And as I was saying, it's obvious once the deepening has happened. But until the deepening has happened, our makeup is so specifically structured that in a way that includes the belief of personal doership, that we know ourselves falsely, I might add. It's a false sense of self. But what we know ourselves as is the doer. And so this description that we're not the doer is just it's a concept, but it doesn't land in a way that we have a frame of reference for at first. At first, it's like, well, you keep saying that we're not the doer, but that's not my experience. So that's what today's satsang is about, because that's how life is that it isn't our experience. And when I say it isn't our experience, it can just seem so foreign, like there's no frame of reference for that concept, we're not the doers, to be anything more than just a concept. And we're saying, so how does that understanding go deeper so that it starts to be my experience? Oh, I'm not the doer. So I'm using this hypothetical person that says, I don't get it. Isn't it obvious that we're not the doers? And that's a sign of that it's important for me to reiterate that response is a response where it has become deeply obvious. The body-mind organism has been seen as a machine, as a biological instrument, as a biological robot, functioning exactly according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so when it's seen, not just a little glimpse, but when everything that happens through the body-mind organism, the speaking, when there is the visual of the body-mind organism, the fingernails, the fingers, the skin, the hair, the feelings, and all of that is known to only come from one place. And that one place is the complex design of the body-mind organism. Then all that you see is the functioning of a body-mind organism. So it's like, it's obvious. What we have to appreciate is that there is a structure in us that can make it completely not obvious. So I was saying just a few minutes ago, that's what this satsang is about, because we can explain it in 2 minutes and then say, there you go. If you don't get it, well, I don't know what to do, because there it is, I told you. And so the way that the understanding goes deeper is if the concepts, the words that I put out, land in a way that clicks. Now, not the whole thing necessarily, but just one small thing clicks. We might not have understood intellectually that thoughts are part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And that can very much happen. We can see certain movements as not my doing. Even certain experiences feel very much like a happening. When we're creating art, for example, you can get into like a zone where it feels like the art is coming out of you and you are not the one doing it. And so in those situations, we can say, oh, there I feel like I'm not the doer. But when it comes to other things, it just doesn't have that same sense. And that might be because we don't necessarily realize that the concept is talking about a certain function, like thinking or emotions. We might think, oh, it's talking about washing the dishes, but it's not talking about my thoughts. And in a particular satsang, because I say something or you read something, or because a circumstance happens and it clicks, then it's like, oh, even my thoughts are not my doing, but are happening. The thoughts are definitely there. They arise for sure. So all of this repeating and looking at it from a different angle and saying is in the hope that that repeating is going to make what is being said just that little bit more understandable. Now, what is very important in this process is that we have to start looking, and this is not, it sounds like an instruction to the doer. You, as the doer, have to start looking at your daily life experience to see the concepts in action. It's not an instruction. It's not a prescription to a doer, because the whole point is that there is no doer. So what is it? On what basis is there no doer? It's on the basis that the body-mind organism is a result of its genes and the up-to-date conditioning. Now, up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of the new conditioning that life is always delivering moment after moment after moment. So that designs the human being, and everything that we consider my doing is a happening, meaning that function did happen. thinking happened, feeling happened, doing the dishes happened, walking in the park happened, driving the car happened, but it didn't get done by the imagined pilot that says, oh, I did that and I could have done it better. It got done by a body-mind organism designed by life. So it's on that basis that we're not the doer. Now, this satsang is essentially just new conditioning delivered by life, and Roger is an expression of life, and you are an expression of life, and your parents and your siblings and your kids, if you have any siblings, if you have any, are expressions of life. So life is always delivering new conditioning through teachers, through priests, through politicians, society, friends, parents, work colleagues. That's life delivering new conditioning, moment after moment after moment. And the new conditioning becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. So the up-to-date conditioning is a cumulative effect, and new conditioning in the moment can radically change your up-to-date conditioning. So when the statement is made is you have to start seeing the non-doership in action in your own experience. It sounds like a prescription. You have to start seeing. It's a description of what might happen. So when I say you have to start seeing the movements of the body-mind organism as a happening, and you'll see that in your own experience, in your own daily life experience. What it means by see it is in the moment a thought arises, it can be seen as a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, the result of the body-mind organism, the result of the biological robot or instrument that is automatically functioning. And when it's seen in the moment, the understanding goes from a conceptual or intellectual understanding to, oh, I see. Even my thought about what Roger is saying in this moment is a happening, not something I created. And I don't know whether I'm going to be happy or angry or frustrated by the words that come out. I only know after the thought or the emotion arises. So you didn't create it, you became aware of it. So the wording, you have to become aware of what the pointers, what the concepts are pointing at, and you'll become aware of it in your own daily life experience, is not a prescription. It is a description of what might happen. What does that mean? It means that here you are being exposed to new conditioning. You weren't in control of what the new conditioning was. I don't even know what I'm going to say until I say it. Even if I have a plan about what to say, which I often don't, then I sit down and who knows what comes out. It might be exactly in line with the plan, it might be completely off, and I'm surprised when it happens. And even if it's completely in line with the plan, that was just because of the way it unfolded. So here you are, new conditioning, not in your control, what I say, and it will land one way or the other. And some of the new conditioning is you must observe what the pointers are saying for yourself in your own daily life experience. And then another concept in the teaching says, but that is not a prescription. That is not an instruction to a doer to do anything. And someone says, it sounds like a prescription. I must do this. No, it's a description of what might happen. So tomorrow you're walking along, a thought arises, and another thought says, that thought is an output of the brain, which is part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. See, that is something that might happen. And that wasn't done by you. That thought that saw another thought and commented, Oh, that's the output of a body of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And then another thought might see the thought that just commented on the previous thought and say, oh, that too is a thought arising as a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And then another thought might see that thought that was commenting on the thought that was about a thought, say that too is a thought. And so that is something that happened as a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if the satsang hadn't spoken about thoughts being a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, if the satsang hadn't delivered the new conditioning, says it's very important for this to be seen in your own experience, not as you're doing that the doer did, but as a happening that might happen. And so if that happens, and then there is a recognition, oh, that's the investigation happening. I don't do the investigation. And someone might say, of course, well, what do you mean I don't do it? The investigation just happened. The whole point of non-doership is the investigation, if it happens, is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Satsang is new conditioning that can change your up-to-date conditioning. And when your up-to-date conditioning changes, the person is a particular way and they will function. And one of the functions of a changed person might be investigation happening. No doer there. So now we go back to the original question. How do I make the understanding go deeper? So we have to start off by saying, no, the question is invalid. Why is the question invalid? Because the question probably includes in it the old way of seeing life, the old attitude that even if it says, oh, I understand non-doership, oh, but how do I make the understanding go deeper? I say, well, are you sure you understand non-doership? Because that question is, I mean, maybe there is an understanding of non-doership if we pull you aside and say, okay, so what does non-doership mean? And you can write a paragraph on it and say, here you go, that's, so you see, I understand it because I've given you an answer of non-doership and it's the correct, and I read it, I go, yeah, that's the correct intellectual, conceptual explanation of non-doership. And yet in practice, the attitude might be of doership, which means we don't really get it, because we really get it when the understanding of non-doership has penetrated into our system and where there isn't a intellectual understanding that we're not the doer, and then in practice, in practice and approaching life attitudinally with the idea of, I must do this. Tell me how to do it. So if that comes up, I say, okay, the question is invalid. Why is the question invalid? Because the question is coming from the belief in personal doership. And the belief in personal doership says, if you tell me what to do, I'll do it. And then there'll be the deepening that I want. Job done. I say, but the belief in the dissolving of the belief in personal doership, or what we can call the attitude of non-doership, understands there's nothing for me to do. There's nothing for me to, I can't ask the question, how do I do it? That understanding will say, it will happen when it's destined to happen. And yet, there has to be more of an answer than just that. To say you can't do anything is only, that's a valid answer, but it's only valid in neutralizing the belief in doership, in neutralizing the attitude that is asking the question. So really, to give that answer is very valid, but then I can't really go on and give the other causal explanation, because it might invalidate in a way the answer that says the whole problem is you think you can do it, and actually the principle of non-doership, what is at the core of the teaching, is saying there is no doer that has ever done anything. So that understanding and seeing that there is no doer is paramount. It's what has to be in the background, the thing we always fall back on, the way we end up seeing life. So whenever, after I give that answer, it will happen if it's destined to happen. That's the truth, actually. That's an accurate description. It'll happen exactly as it's meant to happen, when it's meant to happen, if it's meant to happen. Now, what will happen inside the seeker is one of two things. Either it'll be, oh, what a relief. So I don't have to do seeking. No, seeking will happen anyway, if it's destined to happen, but it won't be your doing, because no one has ever done anything. If it's destined to happen, the seeking will happen according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which are already in place. And the genes and up-to-date conditioning the up-to-date conditioning part is always changing, especially because of satsang. So the fact that the listening is happening is the doing, in a sense. It's life doing the change, and then you can see the difference. And so if you go out tomorrow and go, well, there doesn't seem to be a difference, well, that's destiny. So that has to be the primary, the outside view. This has to settle in first. The other response that can be in the seeker is a response of restlessness to that question. So the question gets asked, how do I make the understanding go deeper so that there is an experiential change in my life towards peace of mind, towards the ending of suffering? And I said, well, I'm sorry, but that's the whole point. There is no one to do anything. And that question is coming from the attitude that says there is someone. And that's the answer. And then the seeker might feel an uncomfortableness with that, a dissatisfaction with that. Not necessarily on the intellectual level, but on the but, a but comes out, but, because that isn't a good enough answer. It isn't a satisfactory answer to the doer that wants to make things happen. And so if that frustration happens, then let's see the frustration as a happening. Okay, so that is a happening as a result of your genes and up-to-date condition. No one did that. It is a happening. And then we can see, that's the doership and attachment to outcome, wanting to, like a racehorse, wanting to break out of the stalls and go for it. It's like the racehorse, he's biting at the bit to get out and run. And the doer is like saying, that's my job, give me something to do. And here the answer is, there is no doer. You don't have a job. And it either leads to, and a stopping. Or there is this doership and attachment energy that is wanting to go out there, and it gets completely frustrated with no answer of what to do. So the gift there is, if the frustration is there, see that not as what you are, but as the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is the attachment to the end of suffering, because it's been heard in the concepts of the teaching. So it says, that's what I want. That has become an expectation. So there is I don't want suffering, and I want end of suffering, not as a preference, not as a, yeah, of course, if I could choose, then I'll take peace of mind. But the doership and attachment to outcome, when it hears something preferable, it says, that's what I want, and it insists on it. It becomes an attachment. It says, that's the only thing that I'm going to consider valid, which then means opposition to suffering when it arises, which means moving away from suffering, trying to do the solution. So let's see that movement for what it is, not what you are. It is not what you are. It is a movement within the body-mind organism. And that is something that I encourage a witnessing of. Encourage a witnessing is not once again, it's not a prescription that says you need to, as the doer, do witnessing. It's once again, it's something that might happen. So I'll say it in the way that appears like a prescription, but rather it's saying witnessing is encouraged, or witnessing is a useful movement when there is a witnessing of this frustration, this restlessness. If that witnessing witnesses the frustration regularly through your day, and now it can say, oh, look, there's that movement. Whereas previously, it wasn't looking at that movement as a happening. It was saying, this is who I am. I'm the one asking you what to do. See, that's the getting lost in the belief of personal doership. It's like, I'm asking that question, so I am the question, is our experience. So, oh, Roger, what can I do? How can I get the understanding to go deeper? And our experience is, I am that question. I am asking that question. So how can we possibly witness that question as anything? That is complete identification as the doer asking the question. And so the question is going to be seen as my doing. So there's no possibility of witnessing it. I'm describing that movement as suffering, not what you are. And there's a description not only of suffering as not what you are, but any thinking, even the thinking of the working mind. So the suffering is the thinking of the thinking mind, based on the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. It's a certain attitude towards the future. And the same attitude and principle that looks back on the past and says, oh, I really didn't perform at all well there, and feels shame. And even the working mind thought that says, oh, what am I going to buy for dinner today at the shops? And it thinks about, well, I had salad yesterday, and trying to have less pasta in the week, and I'll have pizza. No, that doesn't really. Yeah. So that thinking of the working mind, that too is not who you are. It is a happening. And previously it's like, oh, that was my thinking. Now it's not suffering. It's not my thinking as guilt or blame or pride, but it's still a thinking where it is not seen as a happening, but rather seen as who I am. The reason that the deepening doesn't happen sometimes is because it's just too bizarre for the structure that is ingrained and says, well, that's me doing that thinking. The description is so far removed, the description that is a thought arising that you didn't create. It's almost like we just can't hear what it's saying. Like, it's almost like blah, 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 blah. So the way that the human being has been structured, is to feel like that's my thought. My thought, I created it. That's who I am. And then Roger says, the thoughts are happening. And Roger says the thoughts that are happening, and the other person hears blah, 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 blah. And so seeing thoughts, even the notion of seeing thoughts, it sort of requires a separation. So that moment when thoughts are seen for the first time can be sort of one of these awakening moments. It's like, oh, it's because a platform has been presented, like a platform has been built behind where the doer or where the identity has been standing. So the identity has been standing inside the actions, inside the thoughts, inside the emotions. And so when you're inside them, you can't see them. They are what you are. And spiritual teachings come along and build platforms for you, a new platform. And a stepping back onto the new platform, once it's built, can happen. Now, that's an analogy. The stepping, there isn't really a platform. So what's actually happening when, metaphorically I can say, a stepping back onto a different platform? When you step back on a different platform, you see thoughts. And you say, oh, wow, I can see a thought as a commentary in the head. Whereas before, the commentary was a commentary in the head, and yet it was me. And so the stepping back and the platform is essentially a rewiring of the brain. And when the rewiring takes a certain shape, there is the sense of a stepping back onto a different platform and knowing oneself differently. That's part of the deepening of the understanding. And it comes when thoughts are seen as objects. Emotions are seen as objects. Suffering is seen as an object. And talking about seeing thoughts as objects, seeing emotions as objects, seeing suffering as objects is part of the rewiring that can lead to a seeing of the thoughts. Now, because we might say, where do I see thoughts? Well, only in the present moment, where they arise as part of the experience. So if this piece is missed out, that the human being is a biological instrument, and the explanation of... So there's a biological instrument. You can you can put a jacket on the biological instrument. So when you put your clothes on, that is clothes going onto the body, onto the biological instrument. So we can define biological instrument. It's very visible and tangible. And then there are other aspects of the body-mind organism, like the brain, which is not so tangible because it's inside there, but let's assume it exists as the central processing unit of the human being, and it's part of the biological instrument. And then there are the outputs of the biological instrument, the thoughts, the emotions, the physical sensations and feelings, and all of the experience of life, the visuals, the sight, the sound, the taste, the touch. And the explanation of where this biological instrument came from is it is the result of the growing genetic blueprint. It is a blueprint that takes form. We see this growing. It's very, it starts off as sperm and egg, very tiny organism, and then it starts growing into a fetus. And then fetus grows into a baby, and then baby is born, and then continues to grow as a baby, and then turns into an infant, and so on and so on. Now that is the growing of the blueprint. And in each moment, that is the biological instrument. So, that's the concept. If we're running around, and I know this happens, I remember for a long time, the word consciousness was sort of a concept in my head, and I had no idea what consciousness was referring to, and it was in these books that I was reading everywhere, consciousness, and so I'd read the sentence, and most of the words, were normal English language words, and then every time it came to consciousness or something, I'd sort of register that the word was there, and sort of read the whole sentence, and not realizing that I didn't actually know what consciousness was or what it was referring to. And I figured that, if I keep reading these sentences with consciousness in it, then eventually I'll understand what consciousness is, which is actually sort of how it works. And in the same way, we might listen to the concepts here, and one of the key concepts is, the body-mind organism, the biological instrument, is the consequence of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if we understand, in a way, I did understand the word consciousness. It wasn't a word I'd never seen before, but I didn't really understand it in terms of what it was really pointing at. And so we've heard the word gene, Gene. We've heard it lots. But do we really know what it means in the context of this teaching? Because we might be using the word gene as it's used in medicine or science, and genes are sort of essentially a small part, can be described as a small part of the human being. It's part of the DNA chain, or it is the DNA chain that is the genes. In the context of the teaching, it's really saying that the whole body-mind organism, which we're describing as the physical baby, and then the toddler, and on and on, now the adult, is the whole thing. When we talk about genes and the blueprint, the genetic blueprint, it's the whole thing. It's turned into the whole thing. So nothing of the adult is not the genes. So whether we have a certain sense of humor or a certain intellectual capacity, whether we're creative or logical or lateral or whatever, whether we like to touch things to understand, whether we like to see pictures, whether we learn in a particular way. All of that is because of our particular genetic structure. And the genetic structure never exists, doesn't grow in life, independent and uninfluenced. It is always growing, interdependent and influenced by things in life, events in life. And specifically, so everything is new conditioning. The new conditioning that is of particular interest is the conditioning we get from parents, from religion, from teachers, from friends, which is really, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, this is how we live, and these are the important values that we have. That's the up-to-date conditioning, or the new conditioning that becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, that is most important to see. And the combination of the genetic structure and this new conditioning has resulted in this moment. So I can say Roger in this moment is a result, is a consequence of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that life put in place up to this very point in time. And in 5 minutes' time, he's going to be different, but the explanation is the same. In 5 minutes' time, Roger will be a result of his genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the up-to-date conditioning will include an extra 5 minutes of new conditioning from life, from what is there now. My own thinking, my own talking is in a way a feedback loop of new conditioning. How I feel when I say something is new conditioning that will happen over the next 5 minutes. As well as a big tree falling on the house, if that were to happen, will be part of new conditioning for this body-mind organism. I might get a huge fright, and my genes and up-to-date conditioning will include that event in my makeup after that point. So we might have been listening to genes and up-to-date conditioning and heard it, maybe 1,000 times. Roger saying genes and up-to-date conditioning. We are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it might just be placeholder words. We know, we think we know what genes and up-to-date conditioning are because they're words we're familiar with, and we might not really have seen what specifically genes and up-to-date conditioning in the context of this teaching is really saying. And so then we might not have realized that this biological instrument is the consequence, the result of everything that came before in life. In particular, it's being described as a consequence of the genetic blueprint that grows, and the influence from the external environment on that growing biological instrument. And if that is understood more than it was yesterday, the understanding has gone deeper. And as it gets understood more like what the description is intended as, it really means we're seeing it, the concept, we're understanding the concept more as it is in practice, which then means we can feel it. It means that, of course, a thought is an output of this body-mind organism in this moment, which is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And I wasn't in control of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the concept says there is only those two factors that contribute to the biological and psychological movement of the human being. No third factor that determines the biological or psychological movements of the human being. And so if I wasn't in control of those two factors, how can I be in control of anything that happens through the body-mind organism? How can I be in control of anything that is part of the biological movement or the psychological movement? Okay, well, I think we can look at some questions. Hello, Philip.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh my gosh, I'm actually here. Let me sit down real quick. And there you are, Roger.
Hello.
um, Hello, Roger. So I I stumbled upon non-dual teachings a little over 2 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I went through. I mainly discovered non-dual teachers through YouTube, and I went through about you know a couple dozen non-dual teachers like in the span of a few days. And
Mm-hmm.
as soon as I found you via Buddha at the gas pump, um, like immediately, like I knew that this is basically it. Like I recognized that this rings true, and this is like the one of the most accurate ways of describing how unhappiness really manifests in life. And
Right.
like, so that was about 2 years ago. And so for the last 2 years now, I've been listening to your talks, watching the YouTube videos, and gradually coming to what I believe is an almost, if not complete, intellectual understanding of the conceptual framework you lay out. And I have a feeling that so it's been about 2 years, and very gradually I can see the suffering starting to fall away, and very gradually, you know, there is more room for peace of mind.
Well,
But
that's a sign
right
that
now,
the
the peace of
understand.
mind is still.
That's a sign the
Sorry, what?
understand. That's a sign that the understanding is more than intellectual, right? If you're actually feeling,
Right,
yeah, yeah.
for sure. But all I'm trying to say is that you know that considering that it's been 2 years, um, you know, the easing up of suffering has been very, very gradual, in the sense that I experience like peace of mind for maybe a few seconds a day now, instead of like no peace of mind at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much that I have extended periods of complete peace of mind. It's more that the intensity of the suffering has become less. In
Okay.
any case, I'm not trying to complain about this. All I'm trying to say is that you know, I think a lot of your listeners, from when I hear them ask questions, have been on the spiritual seeking path a lot longer than I have been, and have come to, probably experience a lot more peace of mind than I do. Which all I'm trying to say here is, though, that I definitely understand very clearly what you're trying to say. Anyway, sorry for the long rambling. Basically, um, I've been, aside from watching your videos, I've also been, expanding my understanding of these concepts by talking about them a lot to other people,
Mm-hmm.
especially online and in communities of other non-dual seekers. And so anyway, let me ask a question, I guess. um,
There's in just
so
incidentally, it's worth a plug. There is didn't know what this was, but there's a Discord server. So I think Discord servers are a form of forums. So there is a Discord server on the Roger Castillo Being Lived teachings, which are really Ramesh teachings as well. They're just Ramesh's teachings coming through me. But for those of you interested in having the sort of conversations to clarify things amongst yourselves, now, as of a couple of months ago, or maybe even just a month ago, there is this forum that you can go into, which means you don't have to go into other non-dual teachings where the perspective of the teaching is different and the seekers are different. So look it up. I think you just do Roger Castillo Discord, DISCORD server, and you'll find it. So and go ahead. It just gave me an opportunity to mention that. It's not something I set up. Someone set it up and said, "Is it okay to set it up?" I said, "Yes, sure." So I think people are going in there, those that are interested, to have a chat with each other.
Grateful you mentioned it. I'm actually on the Discord server myself, and I think Discord is a very, very useful, container of these kind of communities where you can talk about these things in a lot of detail with like-minded people. And I also invite people to join the Discord server if they have any questions about the teaching. And, anyways, so like I said, I understand the framework, but I feel, you like to be very, very precise and accurate in your descriptions. And, it's very, very clear what you're trying to say when you say, happiness is the no longer arising of guilt, blame, pride, worries, and expectations, essentially. But I feel that you talk a lot about that when you met Ramesh, you had these sort of qualms with the teaching, and eventually it always turned out that you agreed with Ramesh in the end, and
yes.
that, it was just basically based on a not complete understanding of the framework.
Correct.
So maybe this is the same case here. But okay, let me ask the question then. That I tend to think that as specific as you are on the teaching as a whole, you tend to be a bit wishy-washy when it comes to attachment to outcomes, because you list attachment to outcomes both as the fifth form of suffering and as one of the two beliefs that cause suffering. So you're essentially saying attachment to outcomes is a cause of suffering and one of its manifestations. And I find that to be a little bit, wishy-washy, for lack of a better word, not trying to offend you, of course.
Sure. No, I understand what you're saying.
And so I feel like it would be, you used to often just say, the cause of suffering is the belief in personal doership. And nowadays you seem to be more likely to say it's the belief in personal doership and the attachment to outcomes. And so my suggestion to you here is that maybe it might be useful to say belief in personal doership causes guilt, blame, and pride, whereas the attachment to outcomes causes worries, anxiety, and expectations. And I feel like that might be a little less wishy-washy. What do you think about that?
Yes, you have a good point. I can, I guess, put forward an explanation of why it is the way it is, because there's a reason for it being like that. However, my explanation is not going to be completely satisfactory, because you have a point. And often so Ramesh used to more or less call it the belief. Well, he didn't used to say the belief in personal doership. That's something I changed. He used to say the sense of personal doership. And under that umbrella, the sense of personal doership, came guilt, blame, and pride. And he would also stick worrying and anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcome under that umbrella of doership, which is what you're suggesting. However, he would also, in a different area of the teaching, talk about, so really guilt, blame, and pride were his main manifestations of suffering under doership. It would include worry and anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcome, because we can see that they are linked to the belief in personal doership. Because if we really deeply see that life is going to turn out one way or another, just one way, then the anxiety is superfluous, really. It isn't helpful. And not only it isn't helpful, it comes from essentially believing that we're the doer and can do something about it. And what we're doing about it is worrying. So the worry and the anxiety is essentially an expression of belief in personal doership. However, from my own experience, attachment to outcome, meaning the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, is very much a movement of that fits under doership, but I felt it sort of required its own umbrella in a sense. So I guess I created two umbrellas where there was only one. There used to be one umbrella of doership, and worry and expectation came under doership. I think that worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome are linked to doership, no doubt, because we have an expectation of the future when we think it can be my way, in the same way as we worry when we think it's useful to worry. However, the worry and anxiety, the expectation and attachment to outcome, to me is more specifically linked with an idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, that I need the future to look a certain way in order to be happy. So obviously, I need the future to look a certain way, and I, as the doer, can do it. So it's a combination of the two, but very significantly, this belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So similarly, if I believe my happiness is to be found in outcomes, then I will worry about my outcomes or outcomes I don't want eventuating. And I'll have anxiety about outcomes that I think will lead to my unhappiness. So given that the attachment to outcome and the doership feed into most of the different forms of suffering, so even guilt and blame, you can see is very much linked to attachment to outcomes, because if there wasn't an attachment to outcome, when the other delivers pain to you, if it was known to be just pain and not something that you need in order to be complete, then you wouldn't blame the other, because it wouldn't be such a big deal. So the blaming the other as the doer is inspired by the fact that what the other does is seen to be an attack on who I am, which really means the part of the human being that is believes itself to be dependent on outcomes. So in my seeking, I found that seeing the attachment to outcome thinking often happened that suffering was more pronounced based on the thinking of outcomes and needing life to look a certain way than the belief of personal doership. So hence, that's why I sort of stuck two umbrellas in there instead of one, because I think if you leave doership out of it, there are times when just attachment to outcome is what the suffering really is. And so then your point is, well, under the attachment to outcome umbrella, you are sticking attachment to outcomes under there. Whereas under the doership umbrella, you didn't stick doership under there. Under the doership umbrella, you stuck guilt, blame, and pride, which are expressions of doership. Whereas under the attachment to outcome umbrella, you've actually stuck attachment to outcomes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so then your suggestion is, okay, well, if you are going to have the attachment to outcomes umbrella, then just talk about it as worry, anxiety, and expectation. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just explain what the difference between expectation and attachment to outcomes is. Because,
Please do, because I've been wondering about that.
yeah, so there could be another word that you might, after the explanation, stick in instead of attachment to outcome. So you can have the umbrella called attachment to outcome, and then underneath it you can have worry, anxiety, expectation, and whatever word suits best. I use attachment to outcome. So the difference between expectation and attachment to outcome is this. Expectation is a painting of a picture of what you are insisting on or would like the future to look like. And that is more than just a preference, because you can have a preference and say, well, I'd love tomorrow to be a nice sunny day so that I can do the gardening like I had planned. That's a preference. But if there's no attachment to outcome, if the expectation, if the preference hasn't been turned into an expectation, then when it rains tomorrow, it might be a little bit annoying or disappointing because it's not in line with my preference. However, that annoyance or disappointment won't turn into a sense that I have been attacked. Whereas if it had been turned into expectation, essentially there is a much deeper disappointment. When I mean deeper disappointment, it creates an uncomfortableness. So expectation is the setting in, a desire is one of the words that is used in some teachings. So of a craving for your expectation, or a craving for your preference, more accurately. So a craving for your preference is expectation. And that's a form of suffering even before the outcome happens. If we are going through life expecting the future, what we're essentially saying, I hope that my business turns into a success so that I can be financially independent and this can happen, where we are continually thinking along those lines, which is essentially having more than just a preference, but an expectation. And then that expectation means we are continually thinking about that future happening. And if it doesn't happen, the fact that we have continually thought about ourselves in relation to this imagined future, there is a sense of self that is sort of heavily invested in that outcome. And that expectation, we can keep thinking about it for 10 years without the outcome actually happening, because we're sort of still trying to get there. And the business hasn't failed, it hasn't succeeded, it's in this... And we can spend the whole life just waiting, having expectation. When the business, let's say an investment, you have an investment and you have an expectation of that investment going somewhere where you are quite personally invested in it, not just financially, but your sense of self. So that is the expectation. When the company goes bankrupt and you've lost all of your money, that's now changed from being expectation, where you basically may not have been living for 5 years because you've been waiting and had this expectation. When it goes bankrupt, that's actually the event itself having happened. And the event itself can create this resistance to the outcome. Now, the resistance to the outcome is what I am referring to in that context as attachment to outcome. It's when the outcome eventuates and we can't accept it because there was an expectation, and then the expectation hasn't been met. And then the suffering that arises in that moment is different to the suffering of expectation. It's the suffering of feeling incomplete with the circumstance and being in resistance with the circumstance and therefore not being present, which can, carry on for some time. So I've spent a lot of time answering it because I don't talk about this difference between expectation and attachment to outcomes as essentially two different forms of suffering. One is a mental waiting for something to happen and therefore never really enjoying what you have now. The other is when the outcome happens, and there is a complete resistance, which will then turn into blame and shame, or be accompanied by blame and shame. And they're two essentially different feeling or different forms of suffering.
Thank you. I'm very glad I asked. May I just throw another suggestion at you, not as an expectation that you adopt this concept, but just as, another basis of discussion, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So one way I've been thinking about it is that suffering, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, I think can essentially be described as thinking that I could and should be different, which manifests as guilt and pride, that you could and should be different, that others could and should be different, which manifests as blame, and that life in general and circumstance could and should be different, manifesting as, worries, anxiety, and expectation. And
yes.
And I feel like, your attachment to outcomes umbrella, I was wondering if you think that maybe it could be sort of, you talk a lot about the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. And, you have these two categories of, worries and anxiety, and then expectations. And so I was wondering if it was legitimate to say that attachment to outcomes basically has like two aspects, one of which is the fear of pain, which causes worries and anxiety, whereas the other is sort of an addiction to pleasant outcomes, which causes expectations. How do you feel about that?
Yes, I do agree, and this is the sort of thinking that has to sort of unfold for. So, I had my own thinking. So Ramesh put forward the framework he was putting forward, and then it all permeates down based on our examination of it, exactly as you have, by saying, okay, so what do these words really mean?
Yeah.
And in a sense, then you end up with your own framework. Now, as long as your own framework isn't missing something and isn't confusing anything, then that's great, because that is the deepening of the understanding.
Sorry, my dog barked. Yes, sorry, my dog just started barking. I escaped to the bedroom. Anyway,
No
thank you very much. Because, I essentially agree that, these are all, as you tend to say, just pointers and concepts. And the important part is to, translate these as they relate to your own life experience and see how they apply. It's not so much about, it's sort of, observing your life experience and experientially coming to distinguish between pain and suffering, essentially, is what I think the most of the confusion stems from.
I agree.
To sort of just recognize which aspects of your experience are suffering and as such, irrational and superfluous, and which other aspects are pain and are sort of inevitable and don't actually make you unhappy. And so, as you said, you sort of, you hear non-dual teachings, and then as a result, you sort of, your own mental framework develops, based on your own life experience. And it's just that, your framework is so elegant that I have had to make only very, very small adaptations to sort of apply it to my own life experience.
I actually feel that way about the framework. I think, and as even though it seems like I've made a lot of adjustments, and I probably have, I still feel like it's what Ramesh was saying, but it probably isn't. But nonetheless, the framework that Ramesh delivered to me I often thought that there were shortcomings in it, and that, often I would say, I think I use this word instead of that word. And in the end, I realized, no, that word is better than the word I use. Because when I was using that word, there usually was a little bit of misunderstanding in it. And what really impressed me is that no matter how I look at life, the framework contains it all when it's understood properly. And I still, now after 20 years, I still can't, and the process always changing, I still can't find or feel like the framework isn't robust enough to contain life, or as a description, a description of life. So I am happy, I encourage people to reshape it so it is their own. And hopefully it doesn't deviate in principle much, because I've always been blown away at the robustness of it. Not as my doing or Ramesh's doing. Even Ramesh said, he would say it, this is the clearest teaching. Now, when someone might listen to it without understanding Ramesh's deep understanding of non-dualism, someone might think, well, that's very arrogant of you to say this is the clearest teaching. And I think he was saying it like completely as being impressed, being pleased that this is what was coming through him. And I couldn't agree more. I think, wow, this is a unique gift. Not that the other teachings very much have their place. I think that this just complements a lot of the other teachings, and the other teachings complement this. But it definitely, I think, when it came through in the late 80s and 90s, it found its niche in non-dual teachings, or in the non-dual space, should I say.
Roger, it's such a pleasure talking to you. I don't know how long you've been live streaming, and if there are a lot of other people waiting to ask questions, do you think I would have time to ask you one more question?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So this one is not so much about the technicality of the framework. It's more of a, side point that is probably moot to actually, coming to more peace of mind in your life experience. It's just something that you've mentioned here and there that I sort of disagree with a bit. Like I said, I don't think it's really relevant to the framework itself. Mm-hmm. I just think it's interesting. So what I'm talking about here is that you have said once or twice that animals do not have the capacity for suffering. Mm-hmm. And, you describe pain as being horizontal in time, and suffering, being this extended uncomfortableness with life. And,
no, sorry. The other word, pain being vertical, and suffering being psychological.
Yeah, I just confused the words.
But the suffering is psychological and horizontal, because you can have a headache that is ongoing pain, but it is not on the psychological level.
Yes, understood. Sorry, I was just fumbling my words, but yes, I agree. Mm-hmm. So, pain is vertical in time, and suffering is a psychological, extended, horizontal event in time. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, at least from my observations, I feel like that the higher developed animals are capable of this sort of psychological resistance to life. For instance, just because my dog was barking earlier, to bring her back up again, is that, she has these toys, and she rips them up and takes all the stuffing out, and then my wife has to sew the toys back together again. Mm-hmm. And when we take the toys away from her to sew them back together, say my wife doesn't have time right now, and she has to do it, in a few hours from now, our dog lies there pouting. She won't eat her food. She's like clearly miserable and in resistance to the fact that her toy is now gone. And I am almost convinced that this is a sort of form of psychological suffering rather than just emotional pain in the moment of the toy being gone.
Yes. So I guess that statement is made very specifically and with a caveat on it. Let's say, so the basis on which it's the statement is animals don't suffer. Now, because let me, as soon as I say that, let me clarify. I'm not saying animals don't feel pain, and that animals don't have emotions, which means painful emotions. So pain in the moment doesn't includes emotions, and that's the same for human beings. You can have
Yeah.
sadness and anger that is not suffering, but it's on the emotional level, and that is emotional pain. And I'm absolutely on board with the fact that animals can feel some sort of emotion, if not quite complex emotion. The reason it's said that they don't suffer is because the word suffer is being specifically defined as psychological identity, a psychological sense of self. And in that explanation, it's said that the human being is the only animal that has a complex enough brain to be able to self-reflect, reflect on its own existence and say, oh, I do exist, and why do I exist? And life shouldn't be like this, or life should be like that. Now, if animals have that capacity, that intellectual capacity, then they will be able to suffer. The assumption in the concept, so it's a concept, it might not be right, but the concept says the human being, because of the complexity of the human brain, is the only animal capable of self-reflection. Now that concept comes from, in a way, science that has done specific experiments that have been thought out to be able to demonstrate whether self-reflection exists or it doesn't. Now, it's also true that modern experiments might have superseded that idea, and modern experiments might say that some mammals are capable of self-reflection as well as humans. Now, if that's the case, then they will, in theory, be able to suffer. The point is, it requires self-reflection and the capacity to think in terms of time in order for suffering to exist. And so the teaching says that the human intellect, which is described as the most complex, the most developed human intellect in the world as we know it, is, because of its complexity, because of its capacity to reflect, to contemplate one's own existence, and then to ask certain questions, which the concept says animals don't do or can't do, then that human intellect is a double-edged sword. The dubious gift of the intellect, Ramesh used to call it. Dubious gift because it can lead us into suffering, because suffering, the guilt, the blame, the pride, the expectation, the worry, are all psychological movements that are dependent on self-reflection, the capacity to self-reflect, and a complex thinking process of time and shoulds and shouldn'ts and all of that. So what it's trying to do is link suffering with thinking, and it's using that framework to hopefully do that. Now, a lot of people that are very compassionate and sensitive about animal cruelty and whatever, when I say animals don't suffer, they sort of don't hear the real point of the concept, and just arc up about the fact that humans are very cruel to animals, which I completely agree with. They are, and that animals do experience pain, and that I think there should be laws to protect the animal rights, etc., etc. I'm not saying that's not what the point is. So in relation to your point, yes, if animals do have that capacity, which I still don't think they have, but if they do, some odd animal here and there might, then I would agree that the concept is wrong. When it comes to the examples you use, because I had dogs and I saw dogs exhibit certain behaviors that you might. So I had two dogs. One, if I was patting one of them, the Labrador Golden Retriever would come in and knock the other one out of the way to get patted. So
Yeah.
it's and is jealous in a sense. The question is, was he really jealous, or was that his preference, his biological preference, for being patted? And so he figured, if I can knock her out of the way and put my head under Roger's hand where her head was, then I get what I want. And I would often say, George, sit down, go over there, because I'm patting Apple. And then I'd say, come around to this hand and you can get patted as well. He wasn't really happy with that. He wanted her out of the way and for me to pat. And so sometimes I'd say, okay, over there, George, sit down. And he'd go and he'd lie down on his, put his head on his paws and just look at me with eyes like, when's it my turn? So I've registered those behaviors, and I don't think that is psychological suffering in the sense that he's thinking, this shouldn't be happening. Why is he paying more attention to Apple? It will be on the biological level of preference. And I have definitely seen emotions or behaviors that I still put into the category of emotion, and pleasure or pain. And so he's not going to seem excited. He's going to seem unexcited by the fact that he's not getting pats, and not getting food, at certain times and whatever. So it's a gray area, but I've spent a lot of time observing this, and especially thinking about whether an animal looks back into does an animal think about the past and say, that shouldn't have happened. Why did I do it like that? And if we start looking at the thinking as that thinking in the past and in the future about me as a doer, I really still am going to stick with the concept that animals don't suffer in that way, but they do feel emotional pain in the present moment, and they will express that. And so I had, dogs these dogs that would rip up cushions and all of that, and I think it comes down to frustration, built up energy, and a way of getting that energy out. But it's open for the individual to look at it and observe and conclude for themselves what they think that is. But at least that's the concept, my concept, which I say is not the truth. It's a concept. So it's from my perspective, from my interpretation of things, and my interpretation is relative. It's limited, and I'll be the first to say it isn't the truth, because I don't know. We will have information that might come in a year's time, or may have already come and I haven't received it, that will say actually the concept is not correct, and then I will change the concept. But until I get some information that definitively makes me say, oh, I don't think that's correct, then I think it stands for the time being.
No, I agree. It's just a concept, and in the end, we can't really know what another, and we can't even know what another human being really feels, much less an animal.
Exactly.
You mentioned the dubious gift of the intellect, and I thought I would use this as an excuse to sneak in one more question about the framework. I've been meaning to ask you, Ramesh, and you say that free will is a gift that does not fall away when suffering falls away. And so I was wondering, though, if you say the dubious gift of the intellect. Don't you think that maybe free will is also a sort of dubious gift, because this feeling of free will can sort of foster a belief in personal doership?
Exactly, yes. So it is the feeling of free will that is the basis on which the human being has concluded, because it feels like we are free and we are choosing, the belief gets set in place. Oh, it feels like it, so it must be true. It must be the way things are, which is part of the problem with relying on feeling, because feeling often is just an outward, the surface layer, and we haven't necessarily looked below the surface layer. And so the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership is essentially a response to the feeling of free will. But we wouldn't want the feeling of free will not to be there in order to prevent the belief of doership setting in, because then we'd have no doership, but we wouldn't feel free, which wouldn't be that optimal. So you're correct that the doership belief is inspired by the feeling of free will, but we don't want to fix that by taking free will away, which means the best thing is for life to come in and change the deeply ingrained belief of doership by pointing out why it's not viable or valid, by describing what is beneath the feeling of free will. And then we're left with the feeling of free will without the belief in personal doership. So I agree with what you're saying, and also we don't want to categorize it as bad, but dubious is not bad, actually. Dubious is not a bad word, because it's basically saying it can be a good thing, or it can be the basis of a problem. And interestingly, Ramesh never used to really call it the feeling of free will. I call it the feeling of free will because if we just say free will, then it implies that there is free will, which is sort of contradictory to predetermination and non-doership. But there is a feeling of free will, and I think using the word feeling of free will means less confusion and more capacity to see what is important to see, which is that there is a experiential sense of free will which we wouldn't want to be without. And Ramesh used to talk about our free will as being worthless, whereas I call it a gift. And he'd say, well, we have free will. It's undeniable we have free will in the moment. But when we investigate it, we find that our free will is worthless. And that was on the basis that, yes, we have free will in the moment to do whatever we think or feel to do, but when we look at it, we're doing whatever we think or feel based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which wasn't in control. So both in theory, our free will is not really our free will. And more importantly, in practice, once you've done whatever you think or feel to do, the outcome is not in your control. So he'd say, well, we can't deny that there is free will in the moment to do whatever you think or feel to do, but both in theory and in practice, you're not in control. So he'd say your free will is really worthless. Where it becomes worthy or worth a lot is as the feeling in the moment that makes us feel not like a slave. So I decided I'd change it to a gift. The feeling of free will is a gift, which means we can still. It's a paradox where we can hold non-doership and predetermination and still not miss the present moment experience by being lost in a concept of non-doership and predetermination, and still get to appreciate the feeling in the present moment, which is the feeling of, well, no one else is choosing, I'm the one choosing, but still understanding that my choice is what's predetermined and determined by factors out of my control. So that's the paradox. And in Ramesh's worthlessness thing, he, after describing both in theory and in practice, we're not in control. So really this free will that we're talking about, which we have to accept and acknowledge, is worthless. He'd say it's a bit like having going up into the attic and finding a old suitcase, opening it up and finding it's filled with banknotes. And so very excited, like there's over $1 million, very excited. The next morning you go to the bank and you present the banknotes, and the bank teller says, you know, all of these notes are counterfeit. And so Ramesh says, you can't deny that you have banknotes, but in practice, they're worthless. And so that was how he would point at free will, is that you can't deny that you have free will in the moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do, but in practice, it's worthless because you're not in control of the outcome and you weren't in control of whatever you think or feel to do. So,
beautifully spoken, Roger, and thank you for having been my guiding light for the past 2 years.
Thank you for dropping in.
Peace.
See you. We'll take one more question. Hello, Peter. Are you there, Peter? Hello, Peter. Oh, it says it's connecting to your audio. I think you have to unmute yourself, Peter. Okay, now we've got you. Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry, I don't have a question. It's just it's the first time I try this Zoom thing, and I wasn't aware that I love your talking. It's really beautiful. And,
oh, that's right. You had your hand up in the Zoom meeting. So generally that means that there's a question. So that's why this happened.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't know.
No problems.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you for thank you for joining us. Okay. Who's that? Okay. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. Can you say something about silence and stillness? About, yeah.
It seems like a paradox. You want me to talk about silence?
Yes. No, not to talk. I mean, to give pointers or to give, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that silence and stillness is it's not so much about the external environment, not so much about the body moving or not moving, but really about a psychological silence, a psychological stillness, which is a stilling of the thinking mind, a quietening down of the thinking mind. And a quietening down of the thinking mind is not something you can do, because if you try to control the thinking mind, that's more thinking, that's more noise, that's more movement of that psychological identity. So silence and stillness is something that we find setting in more and more in our life as the dynamic at the bottom of the thinking mind, the doership and attachment to outcome. As that gets weaker and weaker, there is a witnessing of those thoughts when they happen as a happening, and eventually those that movement about blaming the other for we see it. No, we see that it's superfluous, that it causes this uncomfortableness, this noise, this lack of stillness, and there tends to be a pulling out of, not by the doer, but a resignation that that's not for me anymore, a cutting off of that thinking. And so to me it feels very much like a falling a falling backwards, dropping down into the quantum aspect of the human being, dropping into a timeless and formless place, even when time and form is in front of us, and we are maybe in the midst of time and form as the body, and yet there's this other dimension, which is the dimension that can be still and quiet and silent in the midst of noise. And so you might have heard, I don't know if I've got it on a diary somewhere. It says, peace of mind is not a needing for your external environment to be still and quiet, but rather it's your attitude to the noisy environment. It's your attitude of stillness and quietness to a noisy environment, which really means to me a dropping out, a pulling back, and a resting in the timeless, formless dimension of the human being that is outside of the flow of life. And that's something I encourage also, not as a prescription, but as a description of what might happen during the day, a dropping back out of activity. It might start off with us needing to even slow down the body activity, but really it's about the inner silence and the inner stillness. But it can require us to slow down on a physical level as well.
It's like I heard once the term thunder or silence, and it feels more like a vibrating. I mean, it can actually become very loud. There's silence, the stillness. I mean, I'm just not clear yet if I'm just aware of the humming of my physical organism, or if this is just another level of distraction that is just another form of thinking, just in a way that I cannot recognize or acknowledge. What I call silence and stillness, is it the real thing, or is it just another level of distraction?
I think it's got a lot to do with spaciousness, a sense of so a lack of the human identity that feels very contracted is, I guess, not silent and not still. And as there's more space, which includes, to me, being present with the momentary experience as a sort of vista, like going. A little practice I used to do, which was always interesting, is if I was watching movies, especially a horror movie, I think horror movies are designed to drag you in. There's the way the scenes are presented to drag you in, especially when they're about to give you a big fright. And I had a decent-sized TV screen on the wall, and I'd watch the movie, but always aware of the frame of the TV and aware of the wall that the TV is on, which is generally not how the horror movie wants you to be aware of the horror movie. It sort of directs your attention into the picture. And I would enjoy watching television where I was aware of the TV border and the wall, and to some extent the cabinet and the bookshelf and the rest of the room, including the body as well. And that is a way that we can see life all the time, where the whole of the experience fits into our field of awareness, rather than this tunnel vision that focuses on individual objects of attention. And if our attention is focused on the whole visual experience regularly through the day, I think there's a sense of spaciousness that opens up, because our thinking slows down, because we're present in a way. We're present with the visuals, and the visuals are, well, they're as present as you can get, really, as now as you can get, and it helps create a space, creates a spaciousness.
Everything happens on the background of consciousness. I mean, the canvas of life, the screen, the silence, the stillness.
Yes, and that's more noticeable when the thinking's not there. And so this vista that we're opening up to is, as you say, it is arising within this background of consciousness, or within this container of consciousness. And by recognizing that, which is more available when we have this open vista, we're essentially recognizing the essence of the human being. And if there is a recognition of the essence of the human being, we have dropped out of the head into the body. Because I think you can feel the essence of the human being much more through the body. In fact, I don't think it's available in the head. So a dropping into the body, and maybe even being aware of the television screen and the wall from the chest, instead of from the eyes and from the head. And I get a sense of that well, it happened for me when I was reading Ramana's teachings, and he was focusing on the spiritual heart and kept talking about the spiritual heart. And over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, I sort of felt almost like a buzzing center of consciousness, where I was aware of life from, sort of drifting down. And for a couple of days, it was sort of in the throat. And I felt like I was seeing life, not seeing it visually, but almost sensing life out of the throat. And then it went down a bit further and sort of came to rest in the chest area. And so sensing life from here allows a much more felt sense. And so I suggest visualizing the center of consciousness as drifting down when your vista opens up. Simultaneously have your center of consciousness drift down as if dragged down by gravity, and from the head into the heart area. Now, I don't know if that can happen if it's stuck in the head. I know that hearing about the spiritual heart being mentioned over and over aided this shift down into the heart, and then once the shift into the heart happened, that became known as home, where life is known from. And if ever I find myself thinking too much about a problem and trying to work it out, and feel, I would like some more presence, then a drifting back down into the chest is part and parcel of having a refreshment, clearing out the logical thinking that might have been happening to solve a problem. Come back down and, here I am. Yeah, that's nice.
I feel my own chest right now very strongly. And I also seem to feel a difference between a right and a left side. But this can all just be imagination because someone mentioned it before. So there's always this feeling of doubt maybe, but you mentioned the word buzzing, and so I can relate to this very strongly.
Mm-hmm.
That there's this constant, like a vibrating, and maybe I just mix this up with stillness and silence.
No,
So those are two different things. The buzzing.
No, I think the buzzing is an expression, especially as there are certain waking ups and shifts in the body. There can be that buzzing sensation, which is linked to the essence. And you're right. I mean, we never know which part of it is psychosomatic because it's been mentioned. But I think I have a familiarity with all sorts of weird sensations, and I don't think that. I think they're all part of the movement. I wouldn't dismiss them too quickly.
The sacredness is in the awareness itself.
Yes.
I mean, the one who is aware of the buzzing is the real. I mean, it's. Anyway, sorry, I don't have the right words, and we are already over time. And I just want to thank you, and it's beautiful.
Thank you, Holger. Always nice to have you. So
thank you.
Well, I wish you all the best.